What's up, guys? I'm Zach.
And I'm Audrey.
And this is week 1 of Collide. We're entering into a new 6-week series about when faith and real life collide. When I think of collide, I think of car collisions, right? A car crash can be pretty disorienting. You don't know which way's up or which way's down.
Have you guys ever felt just totally disoriented in life and you're just kind of mad at God and trying to figure out what the heck's going on? Well, this week we're going to figure out some answers for that. So we're going to go to Joel.
Thanks, Zach and Audrey. So, we're in the book of James for this series, and James is a great person to talk about the real world and faith colliding. You see, for James, growing up, this was actually an everyday thing. In case you didn't know this, it's important as we read this book to keep in mind that Jesus was James' half-brother. Think of all the interactions you have with your family day in and day out that just seem like everyday life things. Now imagine if Jesus was a member of your family in the midst of that. The real world and your faith, your life with Jesus would collide a lot. And so James writes a lot about that in his book. One of the primary things that he starts off with is what I think is one of the biggest areas that we see faith in the world around us collide. And that is trials and temptations. Let's see what James says. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. And we hop down a few verses, and James says this about temptations. He says, Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So there's a few things that we need to draw out from what James tells us about trials and temptations. The first is this, is that trials and temptations are two different things. Trials are something that kind of happens externally from you, and temptations are things that come from within you, from the sinful nature that you have. Think about it this way. My wife is really, really good at making cookies. When she makes a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies, they're warm, they're gooey, they're delicious, and you just can't help but want to eat them. I kind of want one right now, in fact. So imagine that your mom just made a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies, and she tells you those are for company later. Do not eat them. Right in that moment, you have a trial before you. You have this external thing, your mom, that's told you don't eat these cookies, and you have to stand that test and not do it. Now let's say you fail the trial and you eat one. Your mom walks up, she notices the one is missing, and she asks you, did you eat a cookie? Right then you might feel this feeling inside of you that may want to be dishonest and lie about eating the cookie. That right there is a temptation. You're experiencing the temptation to lie about what happened. God allows trials to happen in our lives. Temptations come from our own sinful nature inside of us. Now, while trials and temptations are different, James tells us that the solution for both are the exact same. If you look back at the text and read it, what we see is when James talks about trials and he talks about temptations and those that succumb to them, he uses a lot of language of things that move around, waves that toss about, a lure, like in fishing, that moves and entices a fish. And then when he talks about how to defeat those things, he uses a word that means no movement whatsoever, and that is standing steadfast. When we face trials and temptations, we must stand steadfast on Jesus, his words, and his truths. An example of this would be back in John chapter 16, verse 33. Jesus says this amazing truth. He says, in this world you will face trials, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. In the midst of trials, we can look back to that simple truth and remember and stand steadfast on that Jesus has overcome any trial that you might come up against. So remember, in this life, when faith and real world collide and you experience trials and temptations, you can stand steadfast on Jesus, his truth, and his words.
Thanks, Joel. This week, with your small group, find ways to talk about how to stand firm and to stand strong.
Yeah, you want to focus on standing firm in Jesus, his truths, and his word, because God overcame the world.
See you next week.